I have a 4x8 test bed in my backyard where the soil 2 years ago was so far gone I could not grow a radish in it. Compacted clay, pH down at 4.9, organic matter under 1%. By every measurement I run, it was dead. Then I brewed a 5 ingredient tea. I pulled out of a Depression era extension bulletin, poured 2 gallons of it across that bed once a week for 6 weeks, and did nothing else. No compost, no fertilizer, no tilling. This past August, I pulled 38 pounds of tomatoes off that same bed. The recipe was quietly dropped from federal soil building literature by the early 1950s, right as the synthetic fertilizer industry hit full stride. Stay with me, because the one ingredient nobody expects is what makes the microbes wake up. Let me back up and tell you where this recipe came from, because the source matters as much as the ingredients. About 4 years ago, I was at a library sale up in Asheville, and I pulled a stack of old NC State extension publications out of a box that was headed for the dumpster. Underneath the brittle paper, somebody had clipped a reference to a 1939 USDA Farmers Bulletin in the Soil Building series. Not a famous document, not one you will find quoted in modern gardening books, just a workmanlike Depression-era pamphlet on how to bring tired soil back to life without spending money you did not have. Here is what is interesting. Bulletins like that one were standard in federal extension literature from roughly 1935 through 1947. Biological soil building was a normal chapter heading. You opened the USDA Yearbook of Agriculture and you read about microbes, organic matter, fermentation, manure teas, and crop residues. Then in 1954, the Yearbook of Agriculture was reorganised. The biological chapters were quietly dropped. The new editions were structured around synthetic NPK ratios and standardised commercial inputs. That was the year the language changed. There is a reason for that, and it is not mysterious. During World War II, the federal government built out ammonium nitrate production at industrial scale because ammonium nitrate is what you make munitions out of. After 1945, those munitions plants did not shut down. They were converted to fertilizer manufacturing. By 1951, synthetic nitrogen production in this country was running roughly 5 times higher than it had been in 1939. The industry needed customers. Home gardeners became one of those customers. Now stay with me, because here are the stakes. The average home gardener in this country spends somewhere between $80 and $200 a season on begged amendments. Fertilizers, soil conditioners, lime, supplemental feeds for 70 years to do a job that a 5-ingredient tea did better in 1939 for the cost of pantry scraps. I did not believe it either. I'm a chemistry teacher. I do not believe things because an old pamphlet says them. So I tested it, and what I found in my own test bed is what I am about to walk you through. Here is the recipe. I am going to give you 4 of the 5 ingredients right now, with exact measurements, and I'm holding the 5th for later, because the 5th is the one that decides whether this works or whether you spend a Saturday brewing a 5-gallon bucket of nothing. Stay with me to the end for that one. It matters more than the other 4 combined. Ingredient 1, a 1/4 cup of unsulfured blackstrap molasses, not the lighter cooking molasses you bake with. Blackstrap, the dark, mineral-heavy kind they sell in the baking aisle for about $4 a jar, and that jar will give you somewhere around 8 batches. Ingredient 2, 1 cup of alfalfa meal, the kind sold in any feed store as rabbit pellets or horse supplement. You tie that cup into a square of cheesecloth like a tea bag. The meal will clog everything if you dump it loose in the bucket, and I learned that the hard way the first season. Ingredient 3, a 1/2 cup of sifted hardwood ash. Sifted is important. You want the fine grey powder, not the chunks of charcoal. I save mine from the wood stove all winter and run it through an old kitchen sieve into a coffee can. Oak, hickory, maple, any hardwood is fine. Do not use ash from pressure-treated lumber or from anything you painted or stained. Ingredient 4, 1 shovelful of mature compost from a working pile, not bagged compost from a box store. I tested that and it does not work the same way. Bagged product has been sterilised or sat in plastic for months and the biology is mostly gone. You want a shovelful from your own pile or from a neighbour's pile? that smells like forest floor and has visible white threads of fungal growth running through it. Those 4 ingredients go into 5 gallons of dechlorinated water. Dechlorinated matters. Municipal tap water has enough chlorine in it to knock back the microbes you're trying to wake up. So I either fill the bucket the night before and let it sit uncovered for 24 hours, the chlorine gas is off on its own, or I run it through a cheap carbon filter. Well water is fine straight from the tap, then you stir it or you aerate it. I drop a $10 aquarium air pump into the bucket with a length of airline tubing and an air stone, and I let it run for 24 to 36 hours. If you do not have a pump, you stir the bucket with a long stick 4 times a day for the same window. What you are doing during that steep is multiplying the microbes from the compost shovelful across the entire bucket, using the molasses sugar as their food. By the end of the steep, the surface of the liquid should have a foamy biological skim on it, and the smell should be sweet and earthy, like fresh-turned soil with a hint of bread starter. If it smells sour or rotten, you let it go too long, or your compost was anaerobic and you start over. That is the brew. 4 ingredients you can buy or scavenge for under $3 a batch, plus the 5th I'm holding. And here is the part you will not find in any modern soil amendment guide on any modern shelf. That brewing protocol, almost word for word, was in federal extension literature in the late 1930s and quietly disappeared from the standard rotation by 1954. All right, let us keep going. Now, here is the science behind what is in that bucket, because this is the layer where most people go wrong. They look at this list and they think, okay, molasses is sugar, alfalfa is nitrogen, ash is potassium, compost is general goodness. That is a fertilizer. It is not a fertilizer. I want to be clear about that. If you treat this tea like fertilizer and dump it on a healthy bed expecting your tomatoes to jump, you're going to be disappointed. This is a microbial inoculant with a built-in carbon food source. 2 very different things. Here is what each ingredient is actually doing. The molasses, that quarter cup, gives you roughly 40 grams of usable simple carbon. Sugars in a form that bacteria can metabolize within hours. That is the food. Microbes need carbon the same way you and I need carbohydrates, and most dead soil is dead because the carbon ran out. The alfalfa meal is a slow-release nitrogen source, but more importantly, it contains a natural plant growth alcohol called triacontanol. What that means in plain language is it is a molecule alfalfa produces that triggers root cell elongation and chlorophyll production in other plants. Researchers at land-grant universities have been quietly documenting triacontanol effects since the 1970s, but you will not find it on the label of any home garden product because it is not standardizable and it is not patentable. The hardwood ash is doing 2 jobs at once. It is providing potassium, calcium, and magnesium too in smaller amounts, and it is lifting the pH of the brew itself, which matters because the next ingredient I'm about to describe needs a slightly higher pH range to be biologically active. The compost is the starter culture. That shovelful is carrying somewhere between several hundred million and a few billion microorganisms. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, the whole soil food web in miniature. When you put all of that in 5 gallons of warm sugary water and aerate it for 30 hours, you're running what is effectively a biological reactor. The compost organisms multiply against the molasses sugars. The alfalfa releases its nitrogen and its growth factor into the liquid. The ash buffers the pH. And by the end of the steep, you have a bucket containing somewhere on the order of 1 trillion to 10 trillion active microorganisms ready to be poured onto soil. That is not me being dramatic with numbers. Those are the rough orders of magnitude from compost tea brewing research that has been done at Oregon State, Cornell, and several other extension programs. Research that, again, is not in your average home garden book on the shelf at the box store. So when you pour 2 gallons of this onto a 4x8 bed, you are not feeding the plants. You are seeding the soil. The microbes go to work on the existing plant residue already in that ground. Old root mass, dead leaves, whatever organic matter is hiding in there. And they start breaking it down into the compounds the plants can actually use. And that is exactly the kind of mechanism the extension bulletins from the 1940s described in plain language, and that the post-1954 literature stopped describing at all. Once the microbes are working, the plants get fed by the soil, not by the bag. That is layer 2. Now, let me show you what happened in my own backyard when I actually ran the protocol, because I do not expect anyone to take a microbial argument on faith. I take measurements before, I take measurements after, and I let the numbers do the talking. Here is what the test bed looked like before I poured the first batch on. I want to be honest with you, this was the worst soil on my property. pH 4.9. That is acid enough that most vegetables shut down on nutrient uptake before they even start. Organic matter, 0.8%. For reference, healthy garden soil sits between 4 and 6%. Mine was at 1/5 of the low end, and when I pushed a penetrometer into the bed at 4 inches deep, it pegged past 300 psi. That is compaction so severe that a tomato root cannot push through it. Anything I planted there in the prior 2 years had either died in place or produced 1 or 2 pitiful fruits and quit. 6 weeks later, after 6 weekly applications of 2 gallons each, 12 gallons of tea total, and nothing else, I tested again. pH had come up to 5.8. Organic matter had nearly tripled from 0.8% to 2.3%. The penetrometer reading at 4 inches was down to 140 psi. The bed was loose enough that I could push my finger into it past the second knuckle without working at it. I had not added a single shovelful of compost. I had not tilled. I had not amended with lime, even though the pH had moved nearly a full unit. The microbes did that. The acids they produce, the carbonates they cycle, the structure they build by gluing soil particles together with their own waste. That is what moved those numbers. I planted 3 indeterminate tomatoes into that bed in mid-May. 1 Cherokee Purple, 2 Brandywine. I picked those varieties on purpose because they are notoriously fussy heirlooms. They will tell you immediately if the soil is not right by dropping flowers, splitting fruit, or just sulking. They did none of those things. By the end of August, I had pulled 38 pounds of fruit off those 3 plants. I weighed every harvest. I wrote it in the notebook. And the Brix readings on the fruit, taken with my refractometer the morning of each pick. Brix is the sugar content. Higher numbers mean sweeter, denser fruit, and a plant that moved real energy into what it grew, average 6.8. My usual range across the rest of the garden that same year was 5.5 to 6.0. The fruit out of the rebuilt bed was measurably better. By the end of the season, I retested the soil one more time. pH 6.4, organic matter 3.1%. From soil that could not grow a radish to soil sitting at the doorstep of the healthy range in one season with a 5-ingredient tea and no other inputs. That is the result, and that is the kind of result the bulletins were reporting 80-some years ago before the chapters got pulled. Now, layer 4, application. Because the recipe is only half the story. If you brew the tea right and pour it on wrong, you'll get half the response or none. Here is the protocol I settled on after 2 seasons of testing. 2 gallons of finished tea per 32 square feet of bed, once per week for 6 consecutive weeks. That is the dose. Less than that, and the microbial population cannot establish a colony before the next watering dilutes them out. More than that is wasted. I tested heavier doses and the response curve flattens. 2 gallons per 32 square feet is the number. Soil temperature has to be above 55 degrees Fahrenheit when you apply, and I mean measured, not guessed. I push my soil thermometer 4 inches in and read it before I pour. Below 55, the microbes you're introducing go dormant on contact and most of them die before the soil warms up enough for them to wake. That is why this is a late spring through, early fall protocol, not a year-round thing. And here is the application detail I got wrong the first time, and it cost me. Apply in the evening, not midday, not morning. Evening, after the sun is off the bed. The first run I ever did. Back when I was still convinced this was probably going to be a waste of a Saturday, I mixed up a batch and poured it on at about 1 in the afternoon in full sun. UV radiation kills the bacteria and the fungal spores on contact. I might as well have boiled the tea before I applied it. The results from that first run were maybe half what I saw on the second attempt when I switched to evening application and let the microbes settle into the dark, moist soil and get to work overnight. That midday failure cost me a season of doubt. Do not repeat it. Pour after sundown or at minimum after the bed has gone into shade. Water the bed lightly with plain water before you apply the tea so the soil is already moist and the tea soaks down rather than pooling on a dry crust. And keep notes. pH meter, soil thermometer, refractometer if you have one. The same instruments I use. You do not need expensive equipment to track this. You need to write the numbers down. That is the part of the system the old bulletins assumed any farmer would do, and that the modern bagged amendment industry has trained gardeners out of doing entirely. Because if you do not measure, you do not know what worked, and if you do not know what worked, the only thing left to do is buy more product next year. Now, before we keep going, I want to share something with you. If what I am walking you through here is making sense, and you are starting to see how much of soil building is a measurement problem rather than a luck problem, I wrote the whole structured system down in a book called Steve's 30-Day Maximum Yield Protocol. It is $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. Chapter 3 is the one that goes with this video, Soil Reset, the Chemistry of Fertility. That chapter lays out the pH adjustment rates, the organic matter targets, the micronutrient lineup, and the soil thermometer protocol I just referenced, with 2 diagrams in it. One is a nutrient availability chart by pH, the other is a compost layering cross-section. This book is written for gardeners past the will anything grow stage, who want significantly better results from measurement. If you're watching on your television, point your phone camera at the QR code on the screen right now. If you are on your phone or your laptop, the link is stevesgardenbooks.com, also down in the description. Take your time pulling that up. I will be right here. No rush. All right, let us keep going, because the question I have not answered yet is the why. Why did a recipe this effective get dropped from federal soil literature in the first place? Because if it worked in 1939, it works now. The chemistry has not changed. The microbes have not changed. So what changed? What changed was the structure of the document. The 1954 USDA Yearbook of Agriculture reorganized the soil section around synthetic NPK ratios, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, expressed as percentages on a bag. Before 1954, the soil building chapters discuss biological methods alongside chemical ones, green manures, compost teas, microbial inoculants, mineral amendments. After 1954, those chapters got compressed, sidelined, and in the next few revisions, dropped entirely. The official explanation at the time was standardization. You cannot put a microbial inoculant on a truck and ship it to every county agent in the country and guarantee it works the same way in Georgia clay as it does in Minnesota loam. You can do that with a bag of 10-10-10. The Extension Service needed recommendations that scaled, and biology does not scale the way chemistry does. That is the honest part of the story, and I want to be honest with you about it. The synthetic stuff works. I'm not going to tell you it does not. If you put 10-10-10 on a bed, the plants will respond. The question is not whether the synthetic stuff works. The question is whether it builds anything. And the answer to that question, when you measure organic matter and compaction and microbial activity year over year, is no. Synthetic fertilizer feeds the plant in that season. It does not feed the soil. Once you stop applying it, the bed reverts. Now, the economic force underneath the structural change is the part most people skip. The same chemical plants that made ammonium nitrate for munitions during the Second World War were converted starting in 1945 to make ammonium nitrate for fertilizer. By 1951, synthetic nitrogen production in the United States was roughly 5 times what it had been in 1939. That is a massive industry looking for customers. Commercial agriculture was the first market, but the home gardener, millions of small plots across the country, that was the second market. And the second market only stays a market if the gardener keeps buying every year. A gardener who builds their own soil with a 5-ingredient tea that costs about $3 a batch in pantry ingredients is not a customer. A gardener who buys $80 to $200 worth of bagged amendments every spring, every season for the rest of their gardening life, that is a customer. Multiply that across 70 years and millions of households, and you can see why the bulletins changed. Nobody had to ban anything. Nobody had to issue an order. The literature simply got reorganized around products you could sell. The biology stayed real. It just stopped being the recommended path. And the cost to the home gardener, compounded across 7 decades, is staggering. And the cost to the soil itself in lost organic matter and lost microbial diversity is the part nobody put a dollar figure on. That is what you've been paying for. That is what got reorganized out of the bulletin. All right, let us keep going, because I told you at the start that the one ingredient nobody expects is what makes the microbes wake up, and I owe you that payoff. The fifth ingredient is 2 tablespoons of non-fat dry milk powder per 5-gallon batch. That is it. The same boxed milk powder sitting on the bottom shelf of any grocery store. When I first read the 1939 bulletin, the phrase it used was sweet milk as a fermentation aid. 3 words a modern reader skips right past because who puts milk in their soil? I almost skipped past it myself. Then I tested it. Here is the science. The milk proteins and the lactose feed a specific group of bacteria called lactobacillus, that is the lactic acid bacteria, the same family that ferments yogurt and sauerkraut. In compacted low pH soil, those bacteria are dormant. They are sitting there waiting for a carbon and protein source they can actually use. The molasses alone does not wake them up the same way the milk powder does. Once they are active, they produce organic acids. And what those acids do is chelate locked up phosphorus and calcium. Chill it. What I mean by that is they grab onto nutrients that are chemically bound to the soil and unbind them so the plant can actually drink them. They also create tiny local pH gradients that let fungal hyphae move in and colonize. The lactic acid bacteria are the starter culture. Everything else in the soil, food web, wakes up behind them. I ran the side-by-side. 2 identical batches, brewed the same day, applied to 2 halves of the same row. 1 batch with the milk powder, 1 batch without. The no milk powder version gave me roughly half the microbial response on the soil sample plate I cultured in these garage, and about 60% of the yield bump at the end of the season. Half the microbes, 60% of the harvest, from 2 tablespoons of dry milk powder. One more thing, because even gardeners who try this recipe miss it, add the milk powder last after the steep is finished, when the liquid has cooled below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. If you add it to a warm steep, the heat denatures the proteins and you lose most of the benefit. Brew the 4 ingredients for the full 24 to 36 hours, let it cool. Then stir in the milk powder right before you pour. That is the timing trick, and that is one more layer of the suppression lifted. The bulletin said sweet milk. The modern reader scrolls past it. The soil knows the difference. All right, before I let you go, I want to point you at one more piece of this. The only reason I can sit here and tell you the tea worked is because I measured the bed before and after. pH, organic matter, penetrometer, bricks on the fruit. Without those numbers, I would be telling you a story. With them, I am telling you a result. Chapter 2 of Steve's 30-day maximum yield protocol is the measurement foundation, the record-keeping system that turns any new technique, including this one, into testable proof. It has the template diagram I use in my own notebook, and the diagram showing exactly which measurement points to take on a plant. 115 pages total at stevesgardenbooks.com. If you're watching on the TV, grab your phone now and scan the code on screen. If you're on a phone or laptop, the link is in the description. Take your time pulling that up. I will be right here. This is for the gardeners who want specific numbers, not vague advice. So that is the recipe. A 5-ingredient tea from a 1939 USDA soil building bulletin, molasses, alfalfa, hardwood ash, mature compost, and 2 tablespoons of non-fat dry milk powder, brewed in 5 gallons of dechlorinated water, applied 2 gallons at a time, once a week for 6 weeks, in the evening on soil above 55 degrees. That is what gave me 38 pounds of tomatoes off a bed that could not grow a radish 2 years ago. Now you have what got reorganized out of the federal soil building literature in 1954. The biology never stopped working. The bulletins just stopped printing it. The next video I am working on goes after another one of these, a pre-1950 boric acid pest control method I found in the same extension stack at the library sale, the one I used to stop ant trails from carrying aphids onto my pepper plants for $2 and 1 application. I will walk you through that one the same way I walked you through this one. Tested, measured, documented. Your conditions might be different. Soil chemistry varies, climate varies, microbe populations vary. So test it on one bed before you commit to it across the whole property. That is how you will know. All right, that is what I have for you today. I will see you in the next one.